Cities, even very large cities, can at times suffer destruction of such magnitude as to call their continued existence into question. Now, such destruction can occur quite suddenly, as in the case of a natural disaster or as a result of war, or it can occur very slowly over a long period of time as the result of long-term demographic or economic changes. In either case, though, once the destruction, devastation has reached a certain level, then reconstruction, the effort of making the city whole again, becomes a very large undertaking, one that requires enormous resources and an extraordinary amount of commitment. But it does happen. For example, it happened in San Francisco after the devastating earthquake of 1906, or in Chicago after the Great Fire of 1871. More recently, it happened in New Orleans after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which caused so much destruction that at the time it really looked as if that might be the end of New Orleans as a continuing city, as if it might never come back. In fact, I can remember quite vividly our first mission trip down there after the hurricane to help with the rebuilding of the city, and when our plane landed, it was the only plane in the entire airport. There were no other planes there, and most of the airport was closed down and shut off, was no longer being used. It looked almost like a ghost town. But it doesn't look like that today. No, the city has come back strong. Other cities, of course, have famously been rebuilt after the terrible devastation of wars. Cities very recently, like Dresden and Berlin and Warsaw, all cities that were all but destroyed during the Second World War, but perhaps most dramatically of all, the city of Hiroshima, a city that was utterly and completely destroyed in literally the blink of an eye in 1945, and yet today, over 1 million people live and work in the city of Hiroshima. An amazing recovery. But it doesn't always happen like that. Other cities, even some very well-known ones, have been destroyed and never rebuilt, including major cities of the ancient world like Babylon and Ephesus, and most famously of all, the city of Carthage. Once great cities, where today there are only ruins, if even that. And it happens in modern times as well, where cities that were once thriving centers of manufacturing and population have, over time and for various reasons, withered away to very little and seem well on their way to withering away to practically nothing. A perfect example is Camden, New Jersey, right across the river from us. And until fairly recently, other major cities, places like Buffalo and Detroit, seem to be headed toward much the same fate. Closer to my own home, having grown up along the Mississippi River, there are a number of old river towns which were once busy ports, but which never recovered from the great floods of 1927 or 1937. Places like Cairo, Illinois, and Greenville, Mississippi. So my question today is, why do some cities recover and rebuild and others do not? I don't know that there's any easy answer to that question, and there probably are all sorts of factors involved. But there's clearly something more involved than just a matter of having adequate supplies and financial resources. Though, of course, there does have to be both of those. But beyond that, there also seems to be a need for some sort of reckoning, for some communal coming to grips with what has happened and why, and steps taken then to prevent that reoccurrence, also as to have some degree of confidence that such a fate can be avoided in the future, if not of a certainty, then at least of a high degree of probability. After all, if the city has been devastated not just once, but numerous times, then it becomes pretty obvious that building a city in that place was not such a great idea to begin with. Well, much the same dynamic involved in the rebuilding of cities after a disaster is also present when it comes to rebuilding nations that have suffered a similar fate, where reconstruction doesn't simply mean putting everything back the way it was, but means correcting whatever flaws that had contributed to the disaster to begin with. Gathering a consensus then around those things that clearly needed to change. It's quite clear that in the reconstruction of both Germany and Japan after the Second World War, a war in which both nations suffered widespread devastation in the course particularly of the last year of the war, that what was more critical than simply the rebuilding of the cities and factories of the nation, it was the rebuilding of political institutions. Changes in the political structure intended to ensure that the nation never go down that road again. The same was true in the United States history following the Civil War, where reconstructing the nation didn't really mean simply repairing the physical damage suffered by its cities, which for the most part had suffered relatively little damage, but rather repairing the flaws in the body politic that had led to the catastrophe in the first place. First and foremost, this meant settling once and for all the question of slavery, which was done in the 13th Amendment. And then in the 14th and 15th Amendments, a new foundation was laid for a new conception of citizenship, which represented a transformation in the body politic every bit as significant as the events of 1776 or the adoption of the original Constitution. This year we are observing the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment, which in fact shall be the subject of our annual Constitution seminar this year, and frankly will be my swan song, since this year also marks the 50th anniversary of the event that more than anything else pushed me toward ministry. The tragic death of a man who more than anyone else tried to make those amendments a reality, and tried to do so in the face of continuing resistance on the part of those who had never accepted them, a kind of resistance that is literally enshrined in those monuments that have been so much in the news lately. Monuments that very often had very little to do with the Civil War and everything to do with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But of all the reconstructions that have taken place over the course of human history, the most famous one, I think it is fair to say, was the rebuilding of Jerusalem following its destruction by the Babylonians. I say it was the most famous because a critical step in that reconstruction was the act of putting together what we call the Old Testament. Itself, the conceptual reordering of Israel's history for the purpose of providing a secure foundation upon which the people of Judea could reconstitute themselves as God's people. The Old Testament was for them their reckoning. It was their act of coming to grips with what had led to the catastrophe of the nation's destruction. And therefore, it was their rethinking of what it meant to live into the future as the people of God. Doing that, getting that straight, was actually more important to the future of the Jewish people than the physical task of rebuilding the city of Jerusalem, which had lain in ruins by that point for decades, until the tentative efforts at restoration undertaken by the first wave of people returning from their years of exile in Babylon, and the later more substantial efforts under the leadership of people like Ezra and Nehemiah, though with no small amount of assistance from the Persians. What emerged first, though, in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and then in the life of the people, whether in Babylon or in Jerusalem or anywhere else in the world, what emerged out of this process was a new understanding of God, a new way of thinking about God, about who God was, and how then to structure one's life as one of God's people. And critical to this emerging new theology was the work of two prophets who are not nearly as famous as some of the other prophets who had gone before them. Therefore, two prophets who get nowhere near the credit they deserve for having played such a critical role. While the Isaiahs and the Jeremiahs and the Hoseas and Amoses are all famous for having bravely stood up against the kings of Israel and speaking for justice and righteousness, the fact is it was Ezekiel and second Isaiah. We don't even know what his name was. We just call him second Isaiah. It was those two prophets who actually changed the course of Israel's history. They changed the nation by changing the way people thought about God and therefore what it meant to be God's people. Not that God had changed, of course, but the world had changed. The world had changed dramatically, and it was critical that their thinking about God, their vocabulary with which to talk about God even, had to change. And I think therein lies a lesson for us, because our world has changed dramatically as well. We live today in a very different world than even the world of our parents. And as a result, the church today is in a very different place than the one I grew up in, even than the one in which I was ordained as a minister now almost 40 years ago. And while thankfully we in the church, and I don't just mean this church, I mean the church at large, while we in the church haven't suffered through anything like the devastation of Jerusalem in ancient times, or even New Orleans in more modern times, we are in many ways a little like a Camden or a Detroit We're still here, but we're not nearly the institution we once were, not all that long ago. We don't have nearly so prominent a place in American society. And frankly, we count very little in our world today. And I don't think that we in the church have really adjusted to the fact that nobody out there much cares what we think or what pronouncements we have to make. Which is why I'm increasingly of the opinion that we don't need an Amos or a Hosea or even a Jeremiah these days, nearly so much as we need another Ezekiel or a second Isaiah, someone to rethink who we think of as God in these times, to come up with a new vocabulary by which we can speak not only of God, but even to speak about who we are. A new understanding of what it means to be the people of God in our day. A new understanding from which we can derive new strength for the new day that lies ahead. I am sure that that can be done, but we have to do it.